I parked my car in the dirt lot and stepped out. I went to the back, opened the trunk, and grabbed my bag filled with all the items I would need for this weekend of solo camping. So with my backpack on, I stepped onto the trail. After a few minutes of walking, I stopped to take a drink of water, and as I grabbed my bottle, I heard a branch snapping. I whipped my head around with my bottle in my hand and faced the sound, not knowing what I might see. When I turned, I saw a small rodent leap into a bush. Thanks for the scare, I thought. I continued on the trail, watching the trees stand tall like nothing could knock them down. I felt the calm spring breeze on my face and watched an assortment of animals scavenge for food until I saw the hill the campsite was on. So I picked up the pace until I reached the campsite. I stepped into the campsite and put my bag down. The first 2 hours of being in the campsite were setting things up like a tent, fire, and even a hammock my mom bought me. When it was about noon, I lit the fire I previously built to cook food, and as I ate, I relished the sounds of the forest. I saw the sun starting to set, so I put everything in my tent. I hopped in the tent, zipped it up, and turned a light on inside so I could read for a bit before calling it a night. After reading, I decided to get some rest, so I turned the light off and tried to fall asleep. I was about to fall asleep when I heard someone whisper, "You're gonna sleep with the tent unzipped?" I froze and didn't respond. But sure enough, my tent was unzipped, so with one swift motion, I zipped it back up and sat up. I was waiting for another whisper, but it never came. Were they helping me? Did they unzip my tent? I had a million thoughts in my head, but I just wanted to forget it, so I put my head down again and closed my eyes. It wasn't even 5 minutes when I heard footsteps circling my tent over and over when they suddenly stopped and began pressing on the tent. My whole body felt so heavy it was almost hard to breathe. But I took a breath and then screamed, "Get the hell away!" Immediately, they stopped pressing on my tent, but then began laughing maniacally and slowly started unzipping my tent while still laughing. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and only one option presented itself. If I wanted to survive, I had to fight my way out. I got in the most fight-ready position I could get in, but it was hard in a 3-foot-tall tent. As the tent flap fell, I remember a long-limbed, shriveled man laughing at me with a grin that stretched to his ears. I threw a punch with my right hand, and when I saw he fell from the strike, I jumped out of the tent and ran to my car, leaving my stuff. But as I ran, I realized that another thing was chasing me. 2 things were now hot on my tail, and my adrenaline spiked as I heard one of them scream, "Matthew!" It was the voice that had whispered earlier, but instead of a calm, eerie voice, it was a raspy screech. At that point, I made it to my car, hopped in, and peeled out of there. The next day, I cautiously walked to the campsite. When I got there, all my stuff was there, just the way it was left. The only thing different was a blurb of writing in the dirt that read, "Come back, please, we need your help." I saw something crawling slowly in the corner of my eye. I turned to face it, but there was nothing. Since then, every time I'm solo camping, even in different woods, it feels like a million eyes are watching me from every angle, and I can never shake their gaze. I live in a big city and have been thinking about escaping the hustle and bustle and stress through camping for some time now. When I shared that idea with my friends, 2 of them, Marco and Liam, immediately expressed a desire to join. After 2 weeks, it was time for our trip. We decided to head to the mountain recommended by my father, who had often gone there in his youth. The journey to the mountain took about 2 hours. We parked at the foot of the mountain and set off towards the summit to camp there and explore the surrounding trails. There was nothing around us for miles, almost like in the desert. The nearest village was about 20 kilometers away, just how we wanted it, far from civilization. We prepared our equipment and set off. We reached the top of the mountain without major difficulties, despite our lack of experience in camping. We set up a large tent in which we planned to spend the night. The night passed wonderfully by the fire with meat, beer, and most importantly, lots of laughter. When it was time to sleep, we noticed that the stars were no longer visible because the sky was clouding over. In the distance, we heard an ominous, thunderous rumble. Although we all felt a slight unease, we didn't talk much about it. We lay in silence, and after a few hours, I was awakened by a thunderclap so close that I thought it had struck directly in front of the tent. The rain poured down on the tent, the wind howled, and the tent fought against the wind to keep from flying away. My friends woke up confused about what was happening. I hoped the storm would pass quickly, but instead it began to intensify. The wind was so strong that the tent stakes started to come loose. We decided we couldn't stay there and had to do something. We didn't have many options. The path to the car was too far, and we wouldn't easily make it back in this weather. That's when Marco remembered seeing an abandoned house about 10 minutes away from our location. That was our best option, to take shelter in the house until the storm passed. After a strenuous 10-minute journey that felt like an eternity, we spotted a cabin hidden among the trees near the trail. We made our way down to it, struggling with the rough path. The cabin looked completely deserted, without light, and dense vegetation grew around it as if no one had visited it for years. The door opened heavily. We entered, and immediately we were hit by the stench of decay, as if something in the cabin or nearby was rotting. The cabin was small, with an upper floor, but we didn't pay attention to what was upstairs. We just wanted shelter for a few hours. We sat on old chairs and a bench that was inside, using flashlights to see around us. We were relieved to have escaped the storm, but that feeling didn't last long. Marco explored the cabin and noticed something in the small kitchen. What's this?" he said. We approached and saw fresh, unopened food on the table. At that moment, we heard knocking above us as if someone was closing the door, and then footsteps on the old wooden floor. Jure said we should turn off the flashlights, and we did so quickly. We sat in silence, listening to heavy breathing and the creaking of the floor above us. Suddenly, a voice spoke, a long, eerie voice. "I see you." We felt someone descending the stairs. Quickly, not slowly. I turned on the flashlight and saw a huge man in an undershirt, with long, greasy hair and a large beard, his hands reaching out towards us. But the scariest thing was his expression. He didn't look angry, but he had a creepy smile on his face, eyes wide open as if he could hardly wait to see us. Without a word, we jumped towards the door and fled from the cabin, running like mad. We fell into the mud, but we kept running toward the car, avoiding looking back. After a while, we stopped, exhausted. "I don't think anyone is following us anymore," I said. We decided to take the risk and go back to the car, preferring the storm to going back near the cabin. The journey to the car was quiet. We were all in shock. When we finally arrived, we got into the car, dirty and wet, and drove home. We never found out who was in that cabin, nor did we ever return to find out. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor as Sarah and her friends set up camp for the night. They had chosen a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from civilization, where they could truly disconnect from the outside world. As they gathered around the crackling fire, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. There was something about the darkness of the forest that sent shivers down her spine, something that made her skin crawl. Ignoring her instincts, Sarah tried to focus on enjoying the evening with her friends. They roasted marshmallows over the flames and shared stories late into the night, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But as the fire burned low and the woods grew silent, Sarah's unease only grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something sinister lurked just beyond the trees. As the night wore on, Sarah's friends began to drift off to sleep one by one, leaving her alone by the dying embers of the fire. She wrapped herself tighter in her sleeping bag, trying to ward off the chill that crept through the air. But sleep eluded her, her mind filled with visions of shadowy figures lurking in the darkness. Every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs made her heart race, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Suddenly, Sarah heard a low growl echoing through the trees, sending a jolt of fear coursing through her veins. She sat up, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. That's when she saw it. A pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the edge of the clearing. Frozen in terror, Sarah watched as the creature emerged from the shadows, its hulking form illuminated by the faint light of the moon. With a scream, Sarah scrambled to her feet and stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature advanced slowly, its eyes never leaving hers as it moved closer and closer. Desperate for escape, Sarah turned and ran blindly into the forest, the branches scratching at her skin as she fled. She could hear the creature's heavy footsteps behind her, its growls echoing through the trees. But just as Sarah felt like she couldn't run another step, she burst into a small clearing and saw the lights of a cabin in the distance. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed herself forward, her feet pounding against the forest floor. Finally, she reached the safety of the cabin and threw herself inside, slamming the door shut behind her. She collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving with exertion as she listened for any sign of pursuit. But the forest was silent once more, the only sound the pounding of her own heart. With a shaky sigh of relief, Sarah realized that she had escaped the clutches of whatever lurked in the darkness, at least for now.